This is an example. I'm going to just show you an example of how an ASP.NET kind of razor pages kind of script can be exploited if it's not built properly. So there's a few kind of screens on this I'll go through. So the concept is called overposting, and the general principle is that, let's say we have a model here of a user, and the user has a name, and they also have a field that specifies whether they're an admin user, for example. So this is a Boolean, so that means it's true or false. Now, the concept of overposting is actually that a logged in user, you want them to be able to edit their name and other details, but would you want them to be able to update the isAdmin field? If they're not an admin, then you wouldn't want them to be able to update that, right? Otherwise, everybody will be turning themselves into admins. So the concept of overposting is if you don't program it right, all somebody has to do is fiddle with the HTML, and they could overpost. If they knew what this attribute was called, they could post it, and your code would accept it and update the model. It's bad. Okay, so we'll look at an example of how that would actually work. So here's the razor page form. Just a couple of side points. You see we've got these classes here on all the divs, the HTML. So class form group, class form control, class form group, class button, button small. These are all bootstrap classes. So they style the form. That's just a front-end styling thing. What we've got here, we've got a label and an input field for name. Yeah, name, which is fine. That'll bind it to the name attribute. So it'll load in the name, and let's edit the name when we hit submit. So the button down here, submit button. Here, we've kind of put a bit of code. It doesn't let us edit the admin field, but basically says, there's a little bit of razor code here. It says if they are an admin, so if the isAdmin attribute of the current page model, which is the user, if they are an admin, it will say, just echo out, you are an admin. Otherwise, say you are a standard user. So that seems fine, right? So this form will only let us update the name. Okay. That in itself isn't a problem. Notice that the action here is sending to basically vulnerable, and that just means we've called the recipient page kind of vulnerable. Now, so this is what it's posting to. So a method called vulnerable. We've called it vulnerable because it's vulnerable. Okay, just for an example. Now, what's happening here is that this method is accepting. If you notice what it's accepting a user model, and the user model consists of a name and the isAdmin attribute, right? So if this method gets in a valid model with a name and an isAdmin field, it will say fine. That's a valid model. I'm okay with that. And let's say here, it would update the database. We haven't got the code that does it, but here we would update the database with the model that's passed in. So if we somehow had a way of overriding and posting in that isAdmin attribute and set it to true, this kind of method would accept that model. It would say, yeah, that's a valid model, and go and update the model for a user. So how could we exploit it? Well, actually, if you're aware, you know, in the browser, you can actually edit HTML on a web page. Yeah? Right-click, inspect element in Chrome, and mess around with the HTML. So going back to this HTML here, you could right-click, inspect element, start messing with the HTML. You can add your own little hidden field and input type equals hidden, name equals is admin, value equals true. Hit submit, and you've just submitted the is admin attribute as true. And this method will say, fine by me, and it'll go and update the model. It's just you just turned yourself into an admin. This is demonstrating facts. So when we're running the application and debugging, this is demonstrating that actually this is an example of the model that's been passed in, and actually it's got an is admin value of true. And this method is fine, which is not good. Does that make sense? Okay. So how do we fix that? Well, there's a few different ways, but actually the way that I think it's built in a standard in our tutorial is that we use this try update model async method. So that's a method that says try to update the model based on what we've got. So let's say we've got a student model, which let's say also has a field called unlimited access, for example, Boolean. And we don't want students to be able to edit. Let's say a student, cheeky that they are, they decide to wrangle the HTML and post in that field, that attribute, and we get that student model with that spurious attribute. What happens here, actually, is instead of just passing the whole model over to the database, we're actually specifying, restricting what attributes we want to update. So this method is only going to update first mid name, last name, and enrollment date. So you're actually manually restricting what fields will be updated through this method. So it's actually impossible. Using this method, it would be impossible to update an isAdmin attribute, for example, because it just isn't executing. It's saying, go and try and update the model for the student entity with these values. First name, last name, and okay. So the tutorial code that we use kind of does this already, so we don't need to worry about actually implementing it. But when you see this, that's why we don't. This is why we don't say just get the model, sling it to the database, because actually that's not good practice. So it only updates the attributes specified. Another solution is to actually create kind of a separate model that, in a way, kind of inherits from the main model. We call it a view model. So we've got a student model that has all the fields a student has, but then we can create a separate model that's just for the view, just for the front end user views. And we would call this student VM, view model, for example. And this has the subset of the attributes, just the attributes that we want a user or a student to update. And then we can kind of connect it to the view and make it work that way. And we know that that view, that page, will only let a user update the attributes that are in this view. It's just another way of doing it. So this is what this is how the kind of update method would work. So you're declaring the student view model, and then down here, this is the important line. It's saying you're getting in the values, or you're creating an ad, adding a new student, and then you're setting the current values from the student view model. And they're the only ones you'll be setting. And then save the changes, and then do a redirect. So you've kind of created a subset, a separate class, it's like a subset. Okay? So it's just a couple of examples of how it protects against this concept of overposting.